So what was that for the Mitchell? The scientists, the Ashtagodai, and the Sadigun, and the whoever it was, and the Club Salvas. But he kind of says it, and to me that's just a misunderstanding of what the Club Salvas and maybe that's not the good enough, but what Club Salvas definitely was interested in at all. Because the reason why he's going through the whole process, and also why I want to learn of this, I think there's something to gain out of it. Whatever. Is not because what they can't mine and what they can't what they can't go what they can't aufzuweisen, dass das Jacques hat, ist also zu bleiben in zwei. This is the place where it's more fun, right? So it's important point. If you read modern day people that are interested in proofs, very few of them are going to prove that there's only one God. And in the friend that Mike is stark in that point, dass point proof is going is wegen God. Proof not as I got, and then he makes like a huge jump from that to Shulchan Aruch somehow, which makes no sense.
No, he's very busy with it.
Ich weiß, dass busy with it, but that's
it's the whole thing. But him, that's not Yeshli Yasha V'doich, that's his main point.
But it's Yeshli Yasha V'doich.
Yeah, no, I'm saying what he's trying.
No, for a long time he was only
like,
doing that. And then, for a long time he was only doing that. And then he realized that there's a big hole in his Torah. And he tried to fill it up. But it was
but it looks like that's his main thing. He's saying he didn't do a good job. Fine.
No, it's not the main thing just by volume. Because the Reifetel book is wegen.
Yeah.
Ich will dich nicht nur
He doesn't care about the theoretical thing. He cares about what I'm supposed to do about it. He doesn't care about it.
Of course he cares.
So he only has a practical application. He doesn't really care.
So this is zwei knapp eine. There's about zwei Hudes. One is that it seems this is noch zu gehen wie ich bin. And I'll get to this in a second.
Yeah.
Wie ich bin is as if you read the modern people, most of them at least, very few of them care. Again, not only Mickey, the people that he quotes also all the Christian people and so on. Most of them, not all of them.
William James, like the Meridian or something.
James William Craig, meinst du?
No, James.
William James is nicht apologist, whatever. He's not supporting any religion anyway.
Okay, fine. Nobody's looking at it. No, he's big. No, he's busy. He was very religious.
Side, but ich kann nicht negativ interschmissen. Ich rede, dass der alle Menschen, die sagen, keiner Leben. Avec the Miller, okay, for example. Aber avec the Miller, which is a stupid example because the tragedy is not league. But was a guy to proven it. I says do I got, and you mostly going to work with the arguments from design because whatever, that's what makes sense to him. And then that's all. Now the vet has auch gefragt that is looks nicht du Gott. Weiß auch gefragt dass ja Gott. And since he doesn't really know many people who believe in two gods, or he barely even cares about other religions. He just discounts them. Do something with Mikyan and so on. And because I was nicht sagen kann, was Lamene, was nicht sagen kann, was nicht sagen kann, Christ and so on. But most of his book, or maybe all of it, could just be copy pasted and put in Jesus instead of whatever. Nothing will change. But which is some of the general problem. But there's people that he more whatever. You can't just in the cash was he doesn't. The fact is that he does not worried about that problem. Why is he not worried? Because the people that he's talking to never asked him, after the Trinity, after Jesus the God. Well, then he's worried being them, right?
Even though he don't care about
He's totally not worried about it. He's totally not worried. But
forget.
This is all because nicht nicht äußern this in time base. It is äußern as we can. Begier is for Richard Dawkins, the theoretische Richard Dawkins was sick in Yeshiva and eine kleine Buch. Systems you can prove as God. That's the odds of proof, and he doesn't even also does all of this victor, right? Doesn't even need to have a real proof. Says to be reasonable. It's what I'm saying. He doesn't really, and therefore he doesn't, because his focus is only on disproving that it's not the it's proven as do. So he's totally not interested in most of the things that actually the Rishonim were a lot more interested. Because to the Rambam, and you read the anyone and to the Sadiq when else, to prove that there is a God without proving that the Mushal day the next day gives that if this China gift and that is there's only one, which to the Rambam meant almost the same thing, but there's definitely time. But in other words, that there's only one in the right, what the Chazal was called the true one, Echad Emes, right? This was at least as important to them to prove as to prove that there is. In other words, it's not really what they're worried about. Of course, there's people that they think say Hakshama, but for the basis was like for the benefit they say the Rai is kicking Hakshama. The Rambam doesn't really use them when he argues with people who believe in Hakshama because he knows that they're not philosophers like the Shmi side. When he talks about people that believe in Hakshama, he tries to prove that Muslim status and it doesn't come and say, well, it makes no sense what you believe. It's not even this Shmi. Almost, it's very interesting because it's basically not. He's very conscious of this Rambam. With the example, even the Mara and the order that he goes. I'm trying to learn the beginning of Mara now. The beginning of Mara is just, let me explain how all the psikim which you thought talk about God having a body don't mean that. About 50, 60 chapters about that. Jetzt lassen wir sich den Mann bringt nach Chichlan, was du Gott. And the reason why it's backwards is mostly, I think, because Rambam has different audiences in mind. And he thinks that everyone has to know the first Kailat of Mairan because it opened there. And that's why it's the first. If you open it up, you don't know that. Bis es umkommt, it's the zweite, to the Choche, this is finished for the Shreya Daniga, it's the 12th time. It's not trying to record it to everyone. Aber, for Davis will ja, for the Zil Chos, for Davis will them is the comes on the Chovis Halef and the Minhal of Yiche. He believes that the only way to actually do that is by working through these proofs. In other words, the proofs that Nidge came and Utzefregen, the Hush of Lapekoiris, the Meline of Pashtas Faket, they actually read the Mishnah of Damash to Lapekoiris, was Kedis Achiev if Natsma, Nish Kedamizel can give in Lapekoiris in the debate. In other words, the verschiedene Wegen, wie sie das zu sagen, but it mostly seems to me it's something like this. And this the Wegen sich nachlebt. Het stimmt, was gesagt bisher. In seine gewöhnliche worried, wenn die Menschen sind kehren wegen Kochen and worried and aufregen, there was flaked, and therefore they're totally not interested in things that the Shonim seem to be actually most interested. And nicht nur this, nur all the proofs. They're not zechesot proofs or svuras, whatever you want to call it. It's mamish proof or svura. The edaf, the drama, das nicht yoitze. The ganze book was mechich has to do as civil Shonim is kind of worthless to the Rambam, at least only half the way there. Because he didn't prove what kind of God there is. Or what kind of God there has to be. And because the Rambam and the elements bleiben as this is something that we have to, there's a tricky over here because there's different ways of saying this. Like what the Kenzon in the Torah the Regels, what's going to say, you want to glad to start a pusik, das na vichum is no yotze, this is a silly thing because of course it has to start before that. That's the way that we prove to the people that want to know that but if we talk about just an abstract, then I think there's something like this is going on. And I usually use to say it in the sense of meaning. You have to have a meaning, but under the sort of language actually. The way was gewindig is when he looks Gleibus du a God, Gleibus du ein God. And what does that even mean? So kostet schon Geld, so geht eine so, was nicht nur so kostet schon Geld, recht kostet schon Geld. The difference in what and remembering also kostet schon Geld. In other words, what the Chassidim usually take to mean, the Welt, Meilig will man nennt zu meinen, es Chazik in der Minne meint, tracht nicht nur so, sondern auch tracht, nicht nur trachten, nicht vergessen zwischen Schachris und Messef, nur gedenken noch zwischen Schachris und Messef und so on. All of these things have nothing to do with meaning, right? I could tell you, keep in your mind any nonsense sentence that means zero, totally nothing. White flies, blue coherently. Just a sentence that means nothing. And So ist dreimal Tagen, Gleibes. 100%. And so gedenk, vergesst kein nicht, und macht man auf, and I can even tell you, this makes therefore you should never steal. Ich weiß es nicht. Therefore you should never steal. Wir können sagen, was man will. Man kann auch viele machen, man kann auch viele machen, zwei. Ich weiß nicht, it's at least to basically all the shine, and this is meaningless. This is nicht schwach, Gleibs. We talk about, at least on the level that they're trying to, what they call the Chosovus, calls Chovos Halev. This is the Chosovus' way of saying it. I think he says it most clearly because he's a book of Chovos Halev, and that's why I like to prove it. Because Elchishkan Seifer and Mechich and Amen has a confession like them. We'll upfregen up like that's how they wrote that book. I'm not writing that book. I'm writing a book for people that want to worship God in an internal sense. And then look at basically. Zogen, das kann sich einer sagen. If you want it to mean something, in other words, you have to have some kind of definition of what meaning would mean. But the little mind in that position should say that at least you have to have a definition or understanding of what that is and why it has to be that way. There's two things that to the Choslovus, and they divide them sometimes two different things. What it is einwichtig ist, and according to them, according to the Choslovus and and it's not possible to know what you believe, what the truth is supposed to be, without having philosophical training. And this makes sense. Someone thinks differently. Ich weiß, ich sagen, the Chushik was not philosophy about it. It's afraid not God or whatever. Not pushed at all. Why would we think that it's pushed? I mean, it could be it is. But there's no chachma in the world that's pushing. There's no chachma in the world. You could go around saying you believe in science and vaccines out of science. But what if you want to actually know what that means? I don't believe. Believe means it's like believing by practice. Ich glaube, but the doctor has said it. Okay, that's what you should do. If you can't touch best, it was not a doctor. Learn for 10 years, and verstehen was in mind, and this arbeit, and then you could say that you believe in it. That you know it, right? That's the only way it makes sense. Der versucht, glaubt auch nicht der weiß nur mit Pia Kabul, weiß nicht echt. Weiß, kann sich selber so nach you trust him and so on, but he doesn't know. He doesn't know, he doesn't have knowledge. And to them, having knowledge of God is what it's all about. So this is ein level. And zweite level, was ist tiefer von dem, is dass sie nicht genug zu wissen, als sie Mittel ist. Because to them, and this is based on definition of knowledge, which they get from philosophy basically, that and this is, auf dem kann man schreiben ganz der Bücher, das ist richtig, was sein Weg von Trachten ist, that you only know something, the word wissen can only be said really if you have what the medieval philosophers called demonstrative knowledge. And there was stuff. The Shkodesh has Moifes. This is Nechleg with Moifes, yeah. And what they mean is that if I randomly know something, and therefore some philosophers claim that anything that's not Mechlech, you can't really know. And the best days they leftlists do when they do. Yeah, it happens to be true, but there's no reason it has to be like that. And therefore I can't really, it's not really idea. It's not really knowledge. It makes sense intuitively, right? Wissen alle nice and weet man noch gar kochen. Alle Sachen, was think geschehen echt in der Zeit. Knowledge means knowing, basically knowing laws, knowing regularities, at least knowing how things have to be, or what causes things to have to be. And therefore, to say that there is a God is not enough. You have to know why there has to be one, or why it has to be one. Say that he is one, and of course, the Chaim so fixed was wisst von meinem Leben that's it heißt nicht gewiss laut Choslovus in der Tzadikim. So because you have to know why it has to be. And having the michre, the echraichus from knowledge, the echraichus from any principle is what the knowledge of it is. Therefore, proofs is not about disproving again and others. It's not about even having a suffix. It's about having knowledge. Knowledge means why it has to be that way. It's like any other knowledge, to them at least, means it's only considered knowledge correctly when it's about happening. Therefore, Aristotle sometimes and Plato sometimes said that the only thing that you can really know is God. This is verkehrt. That doesn't mean that God can not wissen. Because the only nitzchi is the thing. So if God is nitzchi, according to Aristotle, and maybe some more things are nitzchi, because the world is also nitzchi and certain and so on. they said, and this is a big theme, and Plato definitely out like this, and I think I know the name and a lot of comments for them that. There's a big theme, a big idea, which is that you cannot know any contingent things. But all contingent things are not really knowable in the sense that so this device is nicht big device. And the only thing that we really know, therefore that's the Rambam would say. The only reason that's why people get confused. The Rambam would probably use this.
Confused with the he got confused with the translation, no, with the Arabic translation, no, with Yakin, with certitude, in the Yakin. No, this in Aristotle was called knowledge versus I don't know, but it's called Yakin, certitude. But
Harikmin says something like this, yeah.
Yeah, but they call it certitude because it's zichir vaduas.
In English, it gets translated usually like having a true opinion versus having knowledge or something like that.
Probable opinion. Probable opinion.
No, I feel that true opinion, according to Plato and according to these people, even a true opinion is not knowledge. There's a hunting philosophy. There's all of these, Gettier problems, and you can have a true.
What?
The Gettier problem, what's known as the Gettier problem, is the illustration of this, because he says you could know something that is true without knowing that it's true. And the vet,
he brings the prime minister's name. The prime minister of England's name starts with a B. The guy thinks that it's Bismarck and Balfour.
This is
so yes, it's true knowledge, but it's by no way is it called knowledge.
Even if you don't know the true one, but you know it because your Rebbe for a false reason.
Right. So that's not called knowledge. Right.
So that's the idea again. This epistemology as Hagers Machlokes Adei Mazetzi is richtig the Akdurim. But their idea it at least makes sense. At least makes sense to talk about knowledge as only what is. You also know why it has to be that way. That's the way it is. And therefore, to talk about God without knowing. Then here I get to my new language. What I wanted to say. Talk about God without knowing what God is for. In other words, why you need Him. What function does this God do? Fulfill in your theory or in your world, whatever it is. One day, it's just nothing. It's just a word, just to signify. But what signifies this? And there, I get back to what I was trying to say. That actually, all of these ways of thinking of proof, they actually show us what, to these people's minds at least, what their God was, what He was doing. Was is erfahren? Was darf man sein? Das ist andere Fähigkeiten. Was darf man sein? Go ask a English guy. Was darf man sein? Was darf man sein? Not was in darf man sein. It sounds silly, but I think it's. I want to actually.
Somebody told me that the Bush fan was asked the little girl. Was the dive?
No.
So he tells them, this is like technical for the bush, but the only time the guy there's a bigger bush, and he told me that this is the only time that he heard that's so crude as a definition from the Irish.
No,
Irish is there was kentin was ich ken nishti.
Yeah, that's an important.
Then, but he said this is like the only time he ever heard the story that he actually defined God this way. He always spoke about this. This was by him God.
Exactly.
Ich kann gut nicht stehen, but ich kann gut nicht stehen.
Oh, that's obviously exaggerated.
Yeah, no, but Bush was extreme. It was an extreme. I mentioned can go nicht stehen.
Right, but just obviously false because it can obviously do something.
Yeah, fine.
That's a very good definition about it. But that's why I definitely want to say it in this language, because I think that's connected to a lot of other conversations. And what is the Irish that is basically what He does for you and why you need Him, why your system, even why you need Him is a good enough reason. Because in other words, I really think that if you were to ask traditional Yidden, maybe even people like talking about the Bible, although nobody knows what the Bible thinks, so it's just everything is made up. What is his God for? What is his God? And he would say something closer to what Rabbi Shimon would say than what Rama would say. I would say the Irish that is the God is the one that, well, we have a lot of different definitions, a lot of different words, right? But there's actually specific ones that they keep on using. You see patterns. For example, if you look in the Tanakh, you see, and there's certain patterns, right? Was ook maar een halen. Yeah, Mikimi, what at least this is at least one very interesting thing that they care very much about what is God for, is for Makimi Fardal and Mashpil Goy, Makbia Shvudim, no wish let's say there, and then I think that the whole story of Crazy Hamsid, which is the next tickle of how continuing that theme. If you read the Shiras Chana, whatever it's called, Chana's you see it saying the same thing. It's kind of they keep on going around. God is, let's talk about like this. God is the one that makes the Roikah. God is the thing that makes.
Could be also the in
the sicher auch, but in andere Werte, God is the Sach, and Paul darf man an God, weil nicht, weil the Yam flies the Welt. And God is actually the one that controls that, and sometimes he actually makes the Yam flies, and that's when the Mitzvah gets stuck in the Yam and so on. But that's the God, that's one of, maybe it's so poetic, but that's one of the functions, the Trachs von Gott, man kann es reden, ja, statt when found out and what does that even mean? What it means to Mr. whoever wrote Hallel, weiß nicht, Hallel sind die andere. Ja, weiß es like gewähnt, was meint ist, mehr weinige, and this is just like, I think that this is like Psyche with Quadamokim, like that's how it seems to structure, like Shmanasra. What they him is, it's the God that firstly he's in the heaven, under the Wette, dort feet alle Shemaim Kvoiden. That's obvious, that's something that says 1,000 times. Yeah? But it's mine was the Rambam mind as a mind as I tried him. That would be the Rambam's translation of this. But it just means in heaven, these days, so whatever this is. But of the was that it is. Er kijkt, man spielt Lehrer, was steht wenn er kijkt, was ist an Job, was darf in sein? Und wenn nicht Gott, weil der Akkur noch der Akkur. In other words, God, this is somewhat the God of Nissim, if you think about it, right? We talked about last week. This is literally the God of Nissim, although not Nissim in the medieval sense of breaking Chikateva. Nissim in the sense of surprising us, right? Adakuriel, this is why I said literally Adakuriel the Shiva, but I was going to, this is literally Mashiva Akeda Sabai Savunim Samayach, yeah? Doesn't have the sad part, how but it has the same thing. They can make the Vasa for Yam, the Yam for Vasa, and the Akura for the oldest for Akura, and so on. The Avian for Gvir, the Gvir for Avian. That's what God is. In other words, when the Gvir is a Gvir and the Avian is a Avian, that's normal. That's not God, right? That's the Chilik, when you talk about the God of. Because the Chilik assumes that's, again, this is poetry. It's hard to take a theology out of this, right?
They always bother me. I was a client kid. I was brought up with Ashkocha Brutus and Mamish others. We can Moitzi Asir. I wasn't
Moitzi Asir and Foidan.
Yeah, Moitzi Asir. I like that.
No, but this is actually the God of Nissim. That's why the God of Nissim is in contrast to the God of the Rambam's God. And there's malice to both. But there are two different conceptions. The Bible's God does not micromanage the world. He obviously doesn't, because otherwise Nissim will not make sense. Otherwise Tfilis would not make sense, and so on. Yochim can good like Mavatal when as Ma'arjan, he was the one that started this thing that God does everything. I just made up this theory yesterday. But build them, there was assumed that we have to wake up God. There are a bit less Ma'arjan that in the Mishnah and somewhere. Something like that.
Yeah.
So but this is at least one way that it can be understood. But the Chemish is God, for the most part. I mean, not for the most part. I don't think there's even this some psikim that people use, like general psikim. I don't think there's even one clear one. But at least generally, if you read all these things, at least there's spells. It's very complicated because they're not doing theology. They're not saying that's what it is. Then there's tells us that when there's a chesbon megadol Hashem, what's trachten, in other words, what's God's function? The function is these chedishim, these fluim, right? These unexpected events. When the Gvir is geworden our man, and the man is one Gvir, and sometimes we can even find some justice in that. But I don't think he's even getting to the justice part, right? So justice, wie heißt die? Beninu, wenn schicks, Kastak, Zerusa, Kim Tchila, the Kim don't start, right? If we read the Lav Havas Punim Lulu, like the Chazal read that her kids died, right? But that, even before that, I don't think it's about that. Like, the God of justice is nothing after that, which is very important to finish. But this is bad. In the Irish, wird nicht das Buch von dem, dass die bist da gewir. Das ist $10 mehr gewir. Machst du Geweih mal die Uhr, whatever. Das ist wird nicht das Buch von dem, dass die bist in der Aschpreis. I'm saying this is not the God of Master Bereich. This is definitely not. If these psikim, you have to understand that when this year that says how comes and stellt sich da, when es kommt, stellt sich da in the hall, was sagt is, wow, God is the one that that does marvelous things, that does unexpected things. And as if the flex, and was it when the man is Urem, wird ihm gemacht Urem. And some he'll ask him also say the Eibisch, ich weiß schon, Welt gesucht, ich weiß nicht. Kennst du das nicht? Kennst du das nicht? It's hard to decide because I'm saying he's not they're not making it not making it but it's definitely true that the way that this poetry works, at least, is that God generally doesn't get involved. He's not involved. He's not a micromanager. A micromanage nicht alles. Of course, there's psikim that say other things, but that's what it seems. The whole idea of the Godness presupposes this. That's why that's why people get so confused with that Ramban, right? Because they say that, because this is actually a contradiction. And at least with Pashtus, try to include. We can actually treffen a second platita that. But with Pashtus, when you say hallow, when you say all these things, you're assuming that normal is normal. The oil menogenoi. However your theory, I'm not. Lozov was the theory of giving. Let's just assume the most simple theory. God doesn't. It's nicht meshigich, man. It matches megishim to trachten, but it makes sense, right? God doesn't generally get involved. It's Allah Shema, it's the Himmel, that of Rashayin Kisakova, the first Idah. And Amol macht the Kim to Be'er, the Hashem, Liris, Brian Udam, and what he does then usually is, macht it right. At least that's what we see. That's when we talk about God. That's what we see. That's the God that we have. This is literally the God of this. This is the God of Kism in many ways. It's the God of. It's not the God of Schar v'Oinish, right? A whole different story.
But we do find that everything that happens that they contributed to God.
Yosef? Yeah, but Yosef.
Okay, I'm dort. Aber
Pasha Yosef was actually very interesting in this context, but nicht so very simple.
No, kan wie bezoekt, had ik gezocht dat ze zo niet. In Mazu so the Kimbuni, the soft pussy with the Abecher, Babakir, it's an angle, you know, like Mazu so the Kimbuni. You see the clue, they saying this.
Yosef's Parsha has a different opinion about this than the whole Sefer Bereshis, definitely. Again, it's silly to because I want to have clarity. The clearest way that I could say it is to make it Kilya Machlok. It's obviously all true in some sense. Right? But the clearest way is to at least each master is an if you actually think of Yosef and Tzadik's the whole story of Yosef, there is a very different God over there than in the whole Sefer Bereshis and in Sefer Shmos. It's very interesting. The ganze Parsha of Yosef, God doesn't speak. You know, nicht to Yosef, nicht to Kanan. He talks to Yaakov. Exactly. He doesn't talk to Yosef. He doesn't talk to his brother. They're all living in a world that's like the one we live in, where God doesn't speak. They obviously live in a very different world than Yosef. It's not like Leiben about the Mata Minna. Those don't have a Minna. They just have God actually walking with them. So him is Alech. Avram Yitzchak Yaakov. Nicht nur those. Moshe Rabbeinu also, right? Moshe Rabbeinu doesn't have a Minna. Moshe Rabbeinu doesn't say like this. Moshe Rabbeinu drusha when it comes to eating, not. And goes this now is Baruch Gocha, Eibish Vital. That's Yosef Tzadik Drush. He literally says that Drush. The Mekish L'Chaim. This is Yosef Tzadik Drush. And Moshe Rabbeinu has a very different Drush. The Drush is there is a God, and he's been waiting. Vergessen mich, weiß was geschehen. It's the man that came to help. Right? It's a very different. Again, it's a very different story. The story of Yosef is actually literally the God of nature or the God of determinism in a certain sense. History is predetermined. It's a very different conception, very different than. It's even, but you have to be precise. You can't confuse these two kinds of hashgacha. Trying to answer what I mean. In Yosef Tzaddik's God, you can't pray to either. This is important. This is not matter. Ich meine James Kugel James Kugel hat mich ausgelernt zu lernen wegen Yosef. Hat einer Kadiri. But James Kugel hat a book of the Bible. Weiß wen? Why James Kugel? Kicken Google. Ich muss auch eine books of the Bible criticism, whatever. But then from the criticism part. And he's Orthodox, whatever. Orthodox.com. Yeah. I've met him.
Oh, okay. But he's
but then I'm not going to say Pashas to keep Shan Zangi. But the local cash to the name is just like he has a taste for certain ideas. I look like this our religious match. He Chavez and whatever. The Tachlis is mine as if an Emma gelernt, they Mahal Chabeh. So it's not ask the Lishan. You should think that I made everything up myself. But I tried to work. I'm not quoting. It's kicking the instead of sound. What I'm saying is that you have to be very careful with this because that's why I try to differentiate different ideas, different mahalachim. And see, we have to make synthesis. But I think we've been doing too much synthesis already in Lakewood, and we get totally confused. Du azar sort God was is the God fin. Again, it's slightly different from the one from Hallel, right? Because the one from Hallel is more generalized, right? It's looking at and we'll get to that. But even that is more like the general idea. Eibishter is where is the Eibishter? Is supposed to do Wasser. This is Ayabusha. As a will it is Ayam. As simple as that, right? But that's the God of listen, literally the God of listen. Right? The same thing. And the Hayotzim says, if it's supposed to in Zene Ma'atem, the Zene Rabban Biad Ma'atem, he could turn that over also, right? It's the same idea. And by the way, nobody thought that was Lamal Derech HaTev. You could read the book of Cheshmenuim, and you see that they talk so much about Rabban Biad Ma'atem, but they don't pretend that something broke the Chikya Tev. It was God. It was God that helped us. It was 100% God. And was the Namash die selben is goed gleich werk gegaan met wem the Alanisim van Zaal, zeg maar Alanisim gewijzen. Aber
that's the same thing.
It was the same language. It's the language we draait zich in the Bible.
No, it's the same.
No,
it's the same school of thought.
Yeah,
it's rule. So
it's 200 years earlier, later. Yeah.
We zijn einen Lake. Well, Machin is moeilijk.
We zijn einen Lake. Like I saw Kinders is married. I don't understand why. I told you they could plaza a book Hanukkah Kipshita. No, he says that there's two shittas of Hanukkah. Eins is the Sefer Makkah, eins is the Megillah of the Euches. This is Chazal. I don't see the difference. It's very Heimish. I think the whole difference is that there's two Gezeires. Maybe there's one Gezeire that doesn't say the word like I don't know what else is the difference. I just don't know what the difference is in my life.
That's a moire idea. It's one time.
Yeah. No, it's very religious. So, but there. It's not, but it's hard to know because this is translated from translation.
It's whatever. I know, but massive. No, they kind of at the bottom of
version of this person.
Yeah, that new guy. But that new guy,
no, it's a professional one. It's very nice. I have a.
Okay, but he kind of says it's kind of you didn't see that.
I saw online. I know what you mean. I know, give up. No, I don't have that one.
Very good. No, they got to schools for Chazal.
Yeah, they also.
The Chazal from the Gemuris. So he kind of says, this is a Kaidism that happened. You come and go is given. So Shtam Shem Shem in Sturis.
That's like but that was later. The Shalos
he's trying to cut out the whole time. He's cutting out Shem Shem.
I hear that's
Shemayim. And the Shemayim. He. I never died to that in the man.
I hear. Okay, but that has to do with our other conversation. Ongoing conversation about that. That's very interesting. Okay, I didn't know. I saw it. Okay. So quite the anniversary. Okay. Naturally, 90 is, but you see them talk about their whole thing is I've Dolphins and Gang whatever. But they're not looking for fine visas to brochen the even Chazal with the story of the menorah is already closer to like I'm not sure even that but it's at least we see it as mamish like he broke.
It's
really magic. aber da ist nein, macht kommen von gegangen von der rechte da von linke Seite, nein, it's go. And it was amazing, right? Because it was not expected. Nobody expected them to win, but they won, and that's called the nest. Nach nine, there's the Einzel God. Then you have the God of this time, which is that, but on an actual personal level. In other words, we're waiting for God to come, and we mean literally. Jetzt ist nicht du, und geht kommen und schlugen damit dem, geht kommen, schlugen Hashem as Pare, geht schlugen Pare, gehabt zu, und geht kommen zu Melech and Achulim, literally by himself. I don't know. And guess what? Avimelech and Lavan were bigger than Yosef. They saw God, and he didn't. Ich habe gesagt, aber ich kenne ihn umgeschraubt. Ist nicht, yes, trick. And it was very, very normal. And this is the God that of Sefer Bereshis. This is the God that you could pray to, and you could pray to in a very real sense, right? Nicht mit dem Mann. When we read them, and the Yaakov community like literally give them conditions. Find Yaakov's tefillah is like most of the Kosh's tefillah. Im Yelem, Himudi. I was like, yeah, Shem, yeah, oh, das mich helfen. That's like most Balbatische. Das mich helfen. Kann ich nachher scheinen, was nicht. Nicht. Im Lav. That's mashma mechlalat nai. Okay, we can do that. But that's what he says. In other words, was a tzad. The Yaakov when he had a suffix, right? The oversaw the Metisrol, so the God helped him. Maybe he got the rose, she got him nicht help. Weißt du was? Mach nadin. That's more or less. It's machzayim magician, but to make it simple. And this is the God from the office. This is the God from Mitzias Mitzrayim, the God of Yiftach, and I love Yiftach, Gidon, right? In the side is bezahlt, als er rausgehen von Mitzrayim, und bei einer Flößechel, und wir können schaffen, da habe ich gekommen, hat gemacht, dann Flöß, and it worked. This is the God of the Sefer Shoftim, I don't know about Sefer Malach. A lot of all these kind of stories is literally this is the God of Mitzias Mitzrayim. The Yiftach is the biggest example of what the God of Mitzias Mitzrayim means. He's the one that he has to help us when we have a problem. I mean, they have to give him honest. Immer shekrani abes ahal. Gesucht, if I get past of time, and you're missing an action. Right? That's not a right. No, and so it's a God that you could pray. God could actually be absent. Not in the sense of has to put on some He's actually nicht do. And we can machen kimmen actually. Yet the Kemen gets better help. The reason, and it's interesting, because in other words, the reason why most of the time we have problems, in other words, us the good ones, right? Of course, if you've been a bad side, it'll be kind of the opposite, is because by default God doesn't do things. But if moires on someone else, let us think. Whatever it is, whatever it's based on, might be based on Schavoinish. Actually, we don't see so much Schavoinish in this whole story. Sefer Bereshis more or less doesn't have Schavoinish. Nor does Sefer Shemos. It doesn't say we got to I wasn't at the Tzadikim in the Shuam. There's no question of the Shuanim had not fear to the Mitzrim. The Torah didn't have that question. Jeden sind in seine Zahne Chevere, and the guy Zayar aus him, and the guy Shluga Zayar Sana. Of course, they're right. That might be implied, but it's not because they are bad. It's not a story of Schar V'Onish. The story of Yitzchak Tzrayim, and that's why all these things, they're not stories of Schar V'Onish. They're stories of a God that helps his beloved people, or maybe because they're Tzadikim, it's just as Stephen. And Gnei Amul he gets busy with other things. I don't know why he doesn't not always there, but he's somewhat limited to God. In other words, nicht Melekos Gebäude in the basic sense. Nicht allemal du and nicht allemal alles. But from the mannen, the Yadalim is nice over Yadalim. It literally says such a pusik. They screamed enough, and he heard and he saw, and he knew. He's a pink metafs. So it's literally said, bis jetzt nicht gehabt. Ein bisschen vertragt, besonders. Ich sage mal, das ist steht. And it's the man. Hey, Kevin. The second he comes, then he tries over the world. He doesn't. He can do whatever he wants. He has, all this makis and stuff. I can't even say it. And these are the two parts of this, two aspects, right? Now, the God of Yosef actually, is a very different God. Couldn't call. Alles is good. Right. So there's two. It goes from both sides. It's different. In one side, everything is good. Everything has a plan. There is a plan. The Mechish, Chanelehim, and it's a very long plan, right? Not from Savalun. The Yosef topic is the gross Baal Mammon in a different sense. Not in a sense that it doesn't. Yosef never davened. But when I go from the Griba, they look. Yes, Chanan Alani lets the breathe, right? We know that from this. He doesn't say. Steitnish again. It could be a date. Again, the story is not about that. But Vayikra Yosef al Hashem. What? Yeah, I understand, but at least we know that it happened. They weren't making it
We know
up,
it
right?
happened. I know. The Torah doesn't bother to tell us that.
No, I don't.
The Torah doesn't tell us that the Brit
Right.
Mizuk does it.
Okay, this is something, but this is look. That's what I said. Even the story I was saying, talking about this Mamshit, even the story of Yosef getting out of the Grib, Mikhaitz, is nicht. Of course, the Chazal that got bothered by this. He said that Yosef Rosgan to Grib. He had a long-term plan that worked. You know, I think if I guess that's why you decided to and stuff, Yosef plan gelungen, right? Martin gedenkt, and the best that's at, actually, probably the best time that he could have reminded himself. But so this is Ashkuch. This is Ashkuch Prutus in the modern sense of it's ping gelungen, but nicht ping gelungen. God has a very long plan, and Yosef, which is a Chuchem. I don't think even the word is, it's also a stadless, of course. What we call stadless, but also long-term planning. Yosef's whole thing is that he's a long-term planner, right? Like the scholar from the Tviyah from the Shnasa Sheva. And this is him like God. This is Amani Yafatu. But this God is also a long-term planner. This is the God of Daniel, right? The God has a cat that has a plan for history. It's the God of the Chachumim, not the God of the Nevi'im. That's why I think Yosef is a Chachum. It doesn't say that he's a Nevi. But in Perish, I'm Novi Chachum Chamaychum. It's called the wisdom. This is the book thing. What's called the wisdom literature mostly has this kind of idea. He's the God of the Ajay Chachma. Everything is predetermined. And basically, the only thing that humans have to do is to not get depressed, like they have to not forget. I mean, it's a ma'achakalo. This is the limit from this of God. Almul plan is what going to is to say as when the Toiv. When the Toiv might be not the correct diak, right? Because so basically the Toiv actually give the wrong zap. Beside that plan, so when it's when the Chesh, and then the same thing Yosef himself. I'm saying he does the same thing. He talks with the Salam Ashkem. Like he lays this groundwork, right? They're watching political connections. Like and three, about watching connection with the Salam Ashkem, and watching connection. Macht Seider, right? Like interesting that the Gulz Mitzrayim starts with his connection blessing, right? Yudas Yosef, so this stuff. And it's a new one, okay. That's that. But that's the whole story. And anyway, so that's what Nachman, just to get back to our point, this was a nice delusion. Back to our point, so that's why this is like a God that's why you can't confuse the two meanings of Ashkuch. In other words, you can't have a God. This is very important because it's a contradiction by a whole time. That you can't have the God whose thing is that he is Meshaded Maruchas or his friends at the same time as having the God that does everything all the time. These are two different kinds of God, two different ways of. If the God does everything all the time, actually doesn't need to break the nature ever because everything is already planned out. The Allah is this is Megillah Esther. Right? Yeah, I think it's traditional making like. Yeah, Yosef is very, very similar to Esther in the sense of the Jew and Daniel, Esther, all these stories. Living.
I mean, you can say Pusha, that like basically the way that Ramban, there's a Kal Shakai and Hashem Avayat and Ramban, really.
Yeah.
So, I mean, right?
More or less. Yeah.
So he is Mashal, okay, he's Mashal Menuch Sateva Nishnis. That's like the Nissen the student.
Okay, but so.
Yeah, I have, whatever.
That's why there's a third Hanukkah that are like Shem Alehim, which is like Yosef. The third thing. It's not Nissim and Studim either. That's what I'm saying. The Ramban Nissim and Studim, after the Ramban Nissim and Studim, I was somewhat confused. That's why I'm not happy with it right now. Because the Ramban Nissim and Studim, at least the way it gets understood usually, the Ramban is trying to figure out a structure where all these contradictory things should work. That's what his whole thing is. The Ramban the whole time is doing these juggling acts, like make sure that no ball falls off. Like, but this is a mechanic shop day God was happy thing is on Nissim, and also day God was had a long-term plan, was the Holocaust, was also given the Michu somehow. And there are two different kinds of God. Because the God that has the God of Davrim Avini, what I'm calling now the God of like you're saying, maybe it's not Mediyah, the God of Moshe Rabbeinu, at least the God of Yitzias Mitzrayim, is one that if he gives you a Holocaust, you call him up and you tell him, that's what Gideon did, and that's that kind of God. It's a very different kind of God. And the God that's Yosef's God, is not the God that you could call up because he'll tell you, all you have to do is sit quiet and wait. If you're on the good side of history, that for you the long-term plan works out. But there's no Nissim actually in that. Nissim don't really make sense. There's Nissim in the sense that in the long-term sense, what some people today call Nissim Nesturim, right? The Hantik Ashkach stories. It's always got the plane. That's a very different kind of nest, and it's a very different kind of conception. And Tefillah means something very different than that kind of world, for example. And you can't have what most people try to have, maybe the Ramban is trying to have, is Sai the God was Machnisim and literally could break things any second. The God of Kriyas Yamsef, right? That's Kriyas Yamsef is, I think, the biggest image for this.
Right.
And at the same time doing everything. No, the God of Kriyas Yamsef is actually one that because if you think about it, the only reason he needs Kriyas Yamsef is because he didn't plan everything else. Because there's a Rambam that tries to. He only needs to make these big things because things got out of hand. If alles is our plan, then we don't even need that. You can just plan things out. There's the Mala side, and at a certain time, and so on. The only reason we need Nisim and all these amazing big interventions, right? Intervention is needed, and therefore that God, this is Palis, at least if you talk about the clear, like being the godless Hashem is the Zagreis God, as I can make Nisim. This is very different from the godless Hashem, and the Zagreis God has a plan that's 10,000 years long, and I don't think they could be mishidach very easily together. These two.
Somebody was told me. I don't know.
Of course, the Chemesh has both of that. It's very obvious.
Yeah.
Things to have.
So you find that somebody was told me that the later you go in Tanakh, the less Hashgacha there is. You find like yes, they talk about God doing things. And it's just
very hard to figure out what does that even mean later.
I mean, in the chronology.
Yeah, but even if you are, I guess it's very hard to answer that question. The Tanakh ends with the Chagim with Yirmiyah, which is Yirmiyah Novi, which is doing the same thing Abraham did.
You think you don't find anything?
We do find these differences, but I don't think it could be put on a linear scale of time.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think. Of course.
I'm not sure what it is. It's a guy wants to.
No,
I
think, and also I don't think, I think that everyone is described because it's very. I don't think it's easy to make such a line. It could be the Chvais. The Yosef seems to. This is a good example because I think the whole story of Yosef is mamish a story that could have happened in Abizman Hazeh. But can I say that not one part of that story?
Oh yeah, keep a big name, whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Even that, beside that, but the whole thing, there's nothing. If you read the story, so again, if you read the story, exactly, that's a good example. But if, in other words, it's people that don't talk with God. They have to guess. What's in mind? If you read the story of Pashas Haifer Shamas, because Glab gets Amul Shein, you wouldn't expect it to happen today. If I tell you Hashem Tov did it, you'll tell me. If I'll tell you that the story of Yosef happened, they don't even have to be Chsid Shi to believe it. Of course, this is a way of looking at it. This is Bashkochas, but it's 100% a modern story in the sense of like the Megillah says. Oh, you can't get Megillah says is actually exaggerated. In other words, it's a little. It actually does have this like Kriyas Yamsef kind of thing, where everything is upside down and so on. I think that Megillah says does a shidduch.
Boy, yeah.
Because if you read Megillah says, it is about catching up here. And if you read Megillah says, you see him doing a shidduch, which is a good thing because Megillah says doesn't have an interventionist. God obviously doesn't even have a God at all. Fine, of course, there's different gifts of the Megillah that doesn't have a God,
Yeah.
There's Tarek Mashiach, of course. But stuff, whatever. Aber Buzirat Ya is surprise. So again, Yosef's God doesn't really have any surprises. Of course, he does because there's this whole story of this
like surprises. Surprises like more big. Today, there's not surprise.
So I think that the Megillah.
Where's the surprise?
Okay, ich sage jetzt das nicht angefangen.
No, this is my actually everybody said.
The Megillah is a surprise.
Everything is a surprise. But you don't see a surprise like boom.
No, so there's
nicht
Hashgacha. We can talk like a bit right? There's Yosef's thing, which is like to wait always. He's always waiting.
That's what I would same thing.
Yeah, it's true. But the Megillah is focused on that. He seems to be dark. He literally says "Van Hafech." And you can read the whole Megillah in the Nisach Van Hafech if you want, and show that he uses one with the same Nisach, but the godless and he does it very deliberately. In my book of Megillah, he does it very deliberately. In other words, the Van Hafech is the Kriyas Yamsef idea. But that's in Chatchila, it was about the God that turns over the water, and now it's that the Yosef's God was in a very like he pulls strings from far. He also could make such spiels, which we could I think that's an interesting way of thinking about the Megillah text. Okay. Nachle Anani,
what God is.
Oh, what is God? The Malachim, the Serifim, yeah. So there's also Nachle Anani. So we have to help about. So the other sort of proofs. You were talking about Hashgacha. Yeah. So the Chimish, the Reik Sot, the Allah Sot Nachman, the Chimish. Now the Rambam's God is neither of not any of these things. It's different from all of these things. And this has to do with his proof. In other words, if you talk about proof, this is a very another way of talking, right? If you ask the Mechaber from how this is the proof as to Agah, he'll tell you the proof is Kriyas Yamsuf, or the proof is whatever he's saying, how long, right? That's the proof. In other words, that's how I see. That's I should say proof. I don't know if it's in that sense, but that's the proof. That's what he showed himself. If you would ask the Chemish would say Tzis Mitzrayim and so on. If you ask the Rambam, then he has no proofs, right? He has proofs that he looks at mitzvah science or mitzvah cycle, pure cycle of pure science. And this also means that he has a different kind of, his God has a different kind of tafkid, a different kind of thing. And this is where we got to, we were starting to talk about. There seems to be different aspects that are important that he needs from his God to be. And this is what Chayes Nafesh said. It seems like the thing that he uses the most is the thing of turning the Galgal, right? There is another thing which is more the necessary existent thing, but we have to figure out the relation of these two things, like two proofs. He uses both of them. But there's definitely.
The Rambam has more than one. The Rambam has more than one proof.
Yes,
he has a few, right?
Yes, four in Mordechai Legbayis. And if you want to get out the fifth one, the Fishet is a Chiddush. But even the Fishet is a Chiddush. I think it was just one thing was.
From him, from Mannequin. He said a very interesting part. Over there.
As well. Why does something's wrong with it?
Oh, here, yeah.
Where is it? You see it?
Yeah, I just saw it on the email over there.
This?
Yeah. See, here, belief certainty over there. So it's page. Well, I put over there which page number it is. 139 or something. It's 138. 138.
That's the end then. Put it somewhere already.
Basically, it's busy Masbizan like when are we talking about the same thing, just with differences, and when we're talking about something else in God?
Read what he says. Yeah, but they thought the thing but people call this Nepsandish. Give me a second.
Yeah.
about the identity, that because of the Rambam's thing, that if you have a negation of the God, then you're not over the Zura,
Right,
it's the wrong God.
So here it says that interesting here, the main thing here I want to show you through the instruction, either the world is eternal, which God can be proved in the matter of Israel, or is created, in which can be proved in the matter of the Muslim. And both sides assume that God is the same existent entity. Is one country means if it could be.
Why should there be different gods?
What? No. So if it could be demonstrated that one of the alternatives of Mammon distinction is correct, then strictly speaking, the other addition would not be a proposition by God at all.
What? What is this proof?
I don't know. That's his own shtickle. I mean, I don't know if it's Masber for us. I could put a bring to us a Rambam as they help the Rambam. Well, the Rambam, then if it will be proven one way or another.
I see him talking about if we could know God.
What?
I see him saying that he thinks that the Rambam thinks we could know God, which is also what I think. At least what I think is that the whole project is to try to get a God that we could know. Not knowing would be useless to the Rambam, a God that we can't know. Okay. No, let's go back to where we are. Where we are is something like this, as maybe I don't know where. Where we are is that so the Rambam's God has at least these two. Okay, so you're saying that maybe the God of Jettas Achidish is different than the God of Jettas Akadmus. He says that Rambam seems to assume that it's the same, but he doesn't know why.
No, he doesn't know why, because one can't be demonstrated. Something was demonstrated, then it's considered something different. If it's not, if we can't,
you have to prove that there's a difference.
If it can't be demonstrated, then we're talking about the same thing. This is the Chiddush. That's what he's trying to say.
That's right. So now they start loving Nazat. Now what we have to ask, why is the Rambam so convinced that what he talks about as God is the same thing that Moshe Rabbani talks about as God? That's the oldest kasha on the Rambam. But I think that at least as a matter of religion, as a matter of Torah, this is what you always have to assume. Otherwise, you end up with nothing. The Rambam, and I think the Rambam is not the first one to do this. Yosef Tzaddik assumed that his God is the same God as the God of Yaakov. Whenever we say Kipante, whenever we say the Kaini, the Kaivasan, the Kavrom, the Kayak, all of these words are a bunch of different gods. They could have been different gods. Kamash Pelons and the Zelba, right?
Okay.
Maybe this is what the Mikabulim call like the Yichud of different midas. Right? That's the whole Kamash Pelon. That's the whole Kamash Pelon of Achtes Lafik paganism. The pagans basically took all of these ideas and said, this is one God, this is another God. That's one way of reading it, right? Okay. I got from Zin, I got from the Levuna. They're actually different things, different functions. But the whole big idea, and the Rambam actually has all. That's why it's important to him. He has different ways to prove that the God is one. And some of them connect with this. Have to do with that there's only one. As long as you're a monotheist, the reason committed to monotheism, there's only one God. There's different ways of. Okay, this sort of thing. It seems to me that if both you have monotheism and if you have some kind of idea of tradition that you think that you're perpetuating, you're going to have to assume that there's only one truth, and that the God that you understand is the one that everyone else understood. Although you could say, and then you get into the ship problem, right? Maybe they've understood it slightly differently, and maybe there's different mistakes and so on. But you have to assume that you're talking about the same thing. There's nothing given in philosophy, in the actual physics and philosophy of it, to figure out how exactly that's supposed to work. But this seems to be what he thinks, and because he thinks that his no.
Being such a relief. So he talks about, like when he discusses Aristotle, Aristotle believed. He talks about Aristotelian deity, like.
No.
Right. I'm just saying, not like. He talks about
like the Rambam.
What?
Nicht so wie der Rambam wollte.
Nein,
Right, but I think that
this is the Tag is God. This is like something. Aristotle hat Epsa give you a God, but nicht.
Right. So, but because I'm a fan of these, I think that not only the Ram, but everyone else does it. At least over here, it's you can be more honest about it. But whenever you, every single thing is like this. The Brisker said, "This is a chicken, yeah." But it's true. It makes laugh of him because he has like a weird epistemology of it. Every time we put out film, we're assuming that this is the same, or every time you have a kafuna, right, which is you're assuming that this is what it was meant by. You don't know. There's no real way to know. Not only don't know, it's kind of impossible to know.
What kind of kavuna? What do you mean?
Kavuna is nicht gechilig weg kavuna.
What? We don't know.
Let's talk about neshama, okay? This is easier because it's not God, so we talk about neshama. The Rambam came. I mean, not the, again, it's the same question. Right, there's this shadow. There's a emina. Most people assume that people have something called a neshama. Okay, now what's it? Maze. Kind of nice. Supposedly, like everything. Supposedly, there's a traditionalist understand. There's no interest in this. Nobody thought about it. People had the neshama. Yet the Rambam came on after Aristotle and said neshama means the form of a human, right? See this? That's what he says. He says. In other words, he has this framework where how he thinks reality works, this cholemes and siras and nazevate, and he has to fit neshama into it, right? And he identified it with that. This is how do we accept neshama? Of course, the chalikadin of them came to us. Is nicht what I expect a neshama to be, and so on, right? But he has to assume that his neshama is what's meant by neshama. And if you find someone that says something different, yeah, it's verstanden. Because there can only be one neshama. There isn't another one to assume. This is one reason why he has to assume. That's one reason for the Rambam is everyone that believes in reality. You could go around with these games of his God and my God and his neshama and my neshama. It's only when you assume that there's no reality behind, doesn't have to be any reality behind it, and people can assume this in both directions, right? There's supposedly believing people that assume that I'm like, you have some picture of reality where this fits in, you have some, whatever it is, you have to have a theory. I mean, you don't have to explain it. But if you don't have a theory, then beside it, looks the good. If you have any picture of reality, then everything has to fit into that. You're not going to be worried that the whole thing, like people come and say, it's an anachronism, right? And Aida sagt, seit wie sie sagt, Absazach meint, sagt wieder, wie ist das Harizam. Menschen, handige Menschen, and like even Firma people do the same thing when they talk about arithmetic. Es kann nicht sagen, haben sie das kann nicht geht, Arizas Prinzip. Therefore, the Pshat is wrong. Arizal will tell you that you're nuts. So, on the way, you're saying that Chaysi have seen that, just said it. Fine, that's possible. As long as we assume that even if we assume he doesn't know what he's talking about, but he's trying to get at reality, and he has some way to get it, he's just not just thinking things up. He's based on a pusik, the stuff of his mind, and based on whatever it is, a svur of the stuff of his mind. So he has to fit into reality. And since I have a clearer, more detailed picture of reality than him, so I'll show you what he is talking about. It's an anachronism. It's an anachronism only in the sense if you care about what was in the Mechaber Hafetzira's mind. I don't know what was in his mind, but I know what was in the reality that he was trying to describe. And the reality, there's only one reality, not a bunch of realities. Same thing with the Rambam and God. There's only one God passive, that there can passively only be one God. You want to tell me that Avraham Avinu had a different God, God of the philosophers, God of Abraham, all these people, what they really are saying is either they don't believe in the philosophers at all. It's all shtissim. It's shtissim. It's the wrong way of thinking. As long as there's any valid validity to this, then you have to find where the systems meet each other. You have to find not because they thought, but because the person who said that is. If you believe that they have anything to do with reality. Right. If you're going to tell me that it's all shtissim, which a lot of academia seem to like assume. They don't think that anything is describing any reality. It's all what this guy said about something. Besides, then you can make all these chalikim. As long as you think there's any reality whatsoever, and you care about understanding that reality. If you don't care, I only care about thinking what was in this guy's head, which is totally boring. Who cares? Then you have to has to match with reality. So there's no way out of this. No way out of this. And as a betoch and as a internal Jewish criticism. You can't do that. the only way that you could, does he also go around saying the Williams God and the Yiddish God?
That's right.
Everyone is having their concept, doesn't matter where they got it from, and assuming that that's what was meant. And this is what you have to do if you want to have any continuity of any tradition. Otherwise, we never know anything ever. You don't know that you're experiment the same way. We really don't know. The Aminim start. Let's just play is very important to Aminim because otherwise there's no use in anything. Although it's not logical in a certain sense. In other words, right? Rabbi made two ikrim, right? One said, just doing this is one said this Torah was given to God, and the second one said the one that was given to God is this one. Right? Now
it's missing in some versions. That one, that part, that shtickle, it's very deceiving. The regular one is missing.
This is the definition.
No, it's a new one.
Whatever it is.
It's only one.
To do zwei as a point, okay?
Yeah.
Now, of course, let's try to think about it. Now, the first one is a historical act. Supposed to be a historical act, right? The Master Shoyu Kachor, right? Second one is a contemporary fact, right? Right. It's a continuity of history fact. No, man bishlema das ist der erste, der macht von dem die steht in der Schnas Elef, weiß was Schnas Kach bekach and you make a Chak Leava, you make such a Chak. I understand. You're saying that this, I'm continuing this witness, whatever, that this happened. Okay. The second one is makes no sense to have as a principle of faith. It can only be true on that day. Let's even say that the Rambam took it, whatever it means. I don't think it actually means that it was no Aguas, but let's say it would mean that, right? It does somehow mean that, but it means against the Muslims and so on that say that the Tanakh is corrupted. Let's say it means this Tanakh that you see now. This is the one that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote. The Zelben. There's no. Therefore, this whole idea of this being an Ikram makes no sense logically. Not only because whoever write it in the Rambam's time, maybe next year they're going to change it, because you kind of really don't know if it was a change of between.
Just no, the truth is, strictly speaking, the Rambam's only talking about his story. He's not talking about about the 1,000 years.
That's what I'm saying. Therefore, of course that's true. And Nishnah Day, what I'm saying is worse than that. That's of course. At the Bismama, you could still come and say that was true then, and a year later it was changed. But you could say something worse. Therefore, the Rambam wasn't stupid. Therefore, this whole kind of Ikkim makes no sense. Not logical to have such an Ikkim. It's always a very contingent fact based, and also there's no real way to know that it's actually true. And even if you have some evidence of the first thing being true, you can't really have evidence of this one being true. I mean, you could say, okay, I checked all the however, so I think logically there's a big loch in this kind of thing. But this is Yadu. It's also very necessary. It's necessary for any continuity to exist. Because this is also a big loch in any. The reason why they say it exists is because otherwise he would have a hole in everything he says. Right? Whatever you claim to be the Shem revelation, the Shem, everyone would say, right, that's what you think is the revelation. Really, some Rebbe changed it, and right. So therefore, that's right. Therefore, every minute that says something was once true, someone once said something, for it to be relevant today, has to come with another record that says, and this is what I mean is what he meant. And
he's very busy then. I'm saying, this. No, I said because he brings it up like because if you're gonna scratch out this os, because even though it's very logical, I think it might be very logical. You can find that the Eine Tigel like Abub dort, but the whole Torah is a bunch of voices. So you know, like
right. So lama plov nemur. What might look in the nimshal is that in the same way you can't. The second you accept this, you can't accept. In other words, you have to figure out if it's true, but there's a necessity to assume that what you believe, what makes sense in your picture of reality, is also what made sense to people that were trying to talk about the same reality before. Because otherwise, you kind of have nothing. Because To sagen, another way to sagen that the Rambam came up with, and the Rambam has this suffers from this problem because he was open about the fact that he has more sources. But everyone has more sources. You don't even have to read any other books to have more sources. The fact that you were born in a different year and you're a different brain, it's like the chestnut problem, right? How do I know that when you talk about the table, I'm talking about the same table? Remember? Philosophical, not a problem. How do we ever know that we're talking about the same thing? Two people. You talk about the color red, but it could be that in your mind, the color red means something totally different than mine. Anything, basically. Any outside reality. We just keep managing to talk about it because we never realize we're talking about something totally different. It's always, this is the same kind of problem. And there's no answer to it. It's an assumption. As long as it works, it works. Whatever. The kids is out of it. We can't make philosophy. We can't make the the fact is that if you want to have communication, you have to assume that you're talking about the same thing. So it's really not fair to go and say, oh, so he has a different God and so on. Talk about the same thing. I could explain you very nicely how they're different things. But I have to assume that anyone that understands the fact being like this has to understand that that's also what meant. And you cannot understand that I understand reality. And the only way you could understand, the only way of doing that is by assuming that one is wrong. But you don't really have a way to assume that you know the right one, what he meant. So the only another vet, I feel that traditional is ich bleibe nicht der Rambam Zaristos God. Ich bleibe Moshe Rabbani is God. Okay. What you mean to say is, I believe that the reality is a certain way,
right? And
therefore, I assume that Moshe Rabbani understood it that way. So you're saying exact same thing as the Rambam. The only machlokes is what the reality is.
No, he doesn't believe
exactly. That these are the gleich Moshe's got and Moshe Rabbani got Moshe's got, right? Then all you could be saying is that you understand reality to be a certain way, and you claim to have taken it from the Chumash, but Ram also claims that. So David is best of a name.
No, but he got the
Gears. That's what I'm saying. It's not relevant than a Gears. You are a different person. There's no way to prove. He was very sure that what he understood is what says in Chumash. You're also sure that what you were saying in Chumash.
But Ram would also say Lilai Aristotle. He would also say more.
Then he wouldn't understand. Aristotle. He wouldn't have a clear picture of reality. You also, without whatever it is, you wouldn't understand. It's not helpful. It's not possible to only read one book. And the Chumash itself was written in a world where people read other books that we don't know what they are, and the references them actually openly sometimes. And you can't do this. This is the Martin Luther's theory. Can do this. You can't do this. You can't have touch without touch. It's not possible to read something out of context. You know what? I'm going to have to ask to it like this. Sadness with some people that I'm going to read only the Chumash, and therefore, there's no such a thing. The Chumash itself wasn't written like that because you have to have was my aleph, my basic things. It uses words that existed before there was a Chumash. Right? You can't do that. So therefore, the only thing that you really could coherently be saying is the Rambam thought reality was like this, and therefore thought that Moshe Rabbani says the reality like that. And I think reality is different, and therefore think Moshe Rabbani said something different. This the ganze machlokes was the ultimate thing. This whole pretending that I'm saying original Moshe Rabbani and he's saying that Moshe Rabbani not be Aristotle. They're saying Moshe Rabbani not be you, and he was saying Moshe Rabbani not be him. This the ganze nafka. And if you this pretend claim that you could be Moshe Rabbani himself, that undermines your own claim also. It only undermines the Rambam, but it undermines anyone that's not Moshe Rabbani. There's no way to have the same ideas that he had. Impossible. Literally impossible. Unless you're him. And if you would be convinced of any reality, you would also be convinced that he said that. No, as long as you assume that it's saying the truth.
Well, you could hold that saying like Lamasse, the Rambam,
so then you have two options. You could say that the Rambam is wrong, that the Rambam's reality is wrong. Right. The reality is not like, or you could say that the Chumash's reality is wrong. Those are the two options you have, right? And of course, if you're not doing philosophy at all, it's easy to just say things that are wrong. When we're assuming that you have to kind of show how they're wrong. Honest. This is something that people don't do at all. Whatever. You have to assume what you have to show how it's wrong. You could say we don't care, but this is also that's what I'm saying. You can't do that because we have no way of knowing what the reality that Moshe Rabbeinu talked about was, without having certain assumptions that I thought we could that is outside of what it said. There's not the text by itself. It never happened. It's fantasies. Anyone that says that has been dreaming or lying. So basically, you assume it to be like the reality. Now you could say that you man picture of reality is I trust Moshe Rabbeinu more to describe reality without Parishim than the Rambam. Maybe you could say that.
What?
Try to imagine what to do. You can't try to do. When ich kick auf Leid Chemisch, ich assume that the reality is also you start out Kepshito und sie viel dreidlich. The Rambam assumes that it's not Kepshito. But that's again a machlokes about reality, not a machlokes about the Chemisch. And the machlokes is about that you're happy with the reality being whatever you take out of the Chemisch. And he's not happy. Why? Because he looked at reality and saw it different. You just didn't look. No. But I can't stand with it. You just didn't look, so you're just being stupid. Or you could, let's say you're not just being stupid, whatever, but you just don't agree on the reality. It's not that you don't agree on how to read. It's not the machlokes. It's still machlokes about the reality.
No, I'm just saying, this does come to a point. You say that the Rambam took it out of context. Shade. Not to.
But this is useless. You also do that as long as you're convinced that the reality is like this.
No, I don't.
You definitely do. You could have an official shit that we ignore reality. Okay. But then what you're saying about Chemish is useless because then you're saying Apikoros again. Then you're saying, I'm just saying what was in the Chemish's mind. You could, the only coherent way to do that, it's not really coherent either because it's always also going to be based on assumption. But the only coherent way to do that is to say, I don't think the Chemish matches reality at all. I think that it's the only truth behind the Chemish is what is in Moshe Rabbeinu's mind. I'm going to get as close as I could to that. That's what probably like supposedly are doing, right? They say we're assuming that this has got nothing to do with reality. We're assuming that this has to do with whatever people who made it thought. Yeah. And we're going to try to figure out what they thought without assuming anything that we think. That's the only thing you can do. And the Filima version of that is there, and therefore we're going to think that. Right. But the Filima version is just saying that I think that the reality is like this. But it's not changing the idea that reality is prior to that.
No, it's saying that if I would see the world like the Rambam, then I would also do it. That's what you're trying to say.
That you are doing the same thing, just you have a different world than him. You can't have this. What's the reality is. So then, why people don't like doing that is because then they have to struggle with the actual reality.
But I could tell.
Much easier to struggle with what it says now.
But I could tell you, like if I would see the world like the Rambam, then I would take it. I wouldn't believe in the Chemish.
You could say that. You could say that. You would say that. That would be the exactly. The Rambam knows about this option. He's very open about this option. You could ask different people what he actually did about that. But yeah, you could say that.
So, but
then again, then you have to say that the Chemish is wrong. It's not. This is a silly, like a funny argument that people get into this weird loop the whole time. Since if I would have, they claim people like the Rambam are being dishonest because really they're Apikoros. And if I would think that the Apikoros is right, I would be an Apikoros, and he pretends not to be an Apikoros. He says that the Chemish says he's Apikoros, right? So what are you really saying? You're saying it that you think that the reality is that because this, and therefore you're going to decide to ignore it. The only thing you have, as long as you agree that reality is real, we have to fight with the same thing. So this proves theory. Why is this whole liet seed interesting now? What exactly the film? I can understand the Fry is Tana. The Fry is Tana. The Apikoros is Tana is the Rambam is fooling us in a certain sense. He says that the Chemish says these things. The Chemish is a bunch of stupidities. And das ist der Ende des Philosophy that he claims it's him. Therefore, man geht an Philosoph unchemisch. Man geht geschmitschen mit der Rambam, das mitchemisch zu der Aran steppen lesen der chemisch. That's a coherent argument. And we have to think about what the Rambam would exactly say about this. He has things that he says things about this. But that's a I don't like talking about the Rambam personally too much. It's not interesting. That's a coherent argument. This person, he really is an atheist. He just pretends that this is what the believers mean when they say it. Sure. This makes sense. But then when the religious people borrow it, that I don't find. Because you're doing the same exact thing. Either you have to fight about reality. You could say he's wrong, and therefore he's wrong. And it's wrong in the Faderai de Chemish. Why you have to say the second part? If you think he's wrong about reality, then just say that. You know why you don't say that? Because you don't want to do that work. Reality. But that's useless because you also agree that whatever the reality is has to match is the reality. Either it has to match with the Chemish. According to you, it has to match with the Chemish because the Chemish is real. And according to him, according to your Apicardus version of him, you would just become an Apicardus. Okay, silent. I think the Pneumatic people have a much too easy world. They actually think that it would be a solution to become an Apicardus. But that wouldn't solve anything. We would still have to figure out what the reality is. Kind of doesn't solve anything. There are whole time, the only shala is someone glad in the chemish, someone is glad in the chemish. Oh, the Ram let me feel okay, it's good. But not believing in the chemish doesn't really solve anything. We're still left with the question of, is there a God, of how does God work, how does the world work? Which, according to both of us, is what the chemish is also talking about, right? And some parts of it. You know how to be a moral, good person. Oh, this is the same questions. You don't get put by becoming an Apicardus. A lot of OTD people make the same mistake. Weißt du was? Ogelas, gets an Putin, and just put it in corner. You have the same question. So there are answers. That's the Mitchell. But the primitive people have the whole like this. Laat zich daar, weer een Apicardus, dan get it done. No, when a Chaldan Apicardus. Killing when the Rambam was just said that an Apicardus would not have to worry about Aristo. It's to Chaim will worrying, right? It's not a solution. That the Torah is it's only interesting as insofar as it helps us get to reality or describe reality or does something. It helps us become good. Whatever the reality is, the reality is the God from whatever, and he gets Chava, this is the reality. This is Emes, was steht in Emes, was the reality. Emes is Emes, was the Emes. This is ultimately to me to try to be this problem of saying, oh, he identifies things in his system with things in a different system, which is anachronistic or so on. Of course, it's anachronistic as long as you care only about what's in the people's minds. If you care about reality, then we don't care about this anachronism. And I think that Chazal do this so, it's amazing how these primitive people can have this problem. Because not even one man of Chazal that's even pretending not to be anachronistic. We do it all the time. This is what we're doing. Of course, a lot of people forget, but this is what we're doing all the time. And when we do Chazal, we do the same thing.
That to put
everything. Halacha is like this.
I
don't have to get into like shalas, but no, everything is like this. If you read Rush's Chazal, they definitely assume that the Chemish is having their shala and that it is a diak, yeah. That's not true in the literal sense. It's not pshat. Everyone knows that it's not pshat. We've known that it's not pshat at least since the times of the Rashbam. It's not jeder Chemish da lesen the pshat. It's like when man in the top of the Chemish on the Chazal, they Chazal knew that they're having new questions. They were not crazy. But Akiva didn't really think that all the Chikiras he has, and we don't think really that all the Chikiras of Chaim Brisker has really the Rambam had. Nobody's crazy like that. Few people are, but most people are not. What do we think? Why do we use the Rambam? Because we think that it's about the same reality. We conceptualize the Durim in a certain way, so we're going to be medayik from the Rambam. What's the gate that is? They do the same thing with the Chemish, right? I'm going to be medayik from the Chemish. That's no point. We stop being medayik from the Chemish and we're medayik from the Gemur. We'll do the same exact thing. And sometimes I see people saying, oh, this is nicht kann. Du kannst Sachen, was du mit nehmen in der Gemur, mit treffen, but most of the time, it's always like that. You can't be a Chassidish Yid, a Chassidish Yid, and claim that you have to be not anachronistic. It's like And I don't think it's crazy. I think that's true. As long as you assume that there's a reality, even in halacha, there is the halacha, which everything is trying to describe, right? It's trying to reality. Right? We could use the Chumash, we could use the Rambam, and of course, not the Rambam with Tachting days, but it's because it's the gate, if the name comes out, it's not crazy. It actually makes sense. And I'm pretty sure that we do that very obviously. Let's talk about Yaitzer Hara, Mushal. Simple Mushal, right? You know what Yaitzer Hara is? Not you. The Eglos of In Chai the Bank was Yaitzer Hara is. So in Rasha, Chazal, Yaitzer Tov, Yaitzer Hara. We know what it is. I mean, I don't know. All the Rebbes seem to know what it is. They're talking to teach the kids about it, right? They don't have to know with this concept. Nobody knows exactly what it is. Everyone knows what it is, right? We know that it's the same thing that was meant by whoever. No, obviously not. I could tell you 4 different shooting they might have meant, and nobody knows which one is true. Right? And therefore, we stop using the concept of Yetzirah. We even assume that Allah is an MS in a certain sense. Figure out exactly. Right. So therefore, the Rambam has 2. Let's try to at least know some things. He has at least 3 things, and this goes back to other people. The Rambam is very complex in this. And Rambam had a concept of Messias, and the other concept of Sibirish. Let's talk about the Sibirish, the first mover. And the third thing, which seems to be very important for him, which is for this first mover to be not have a body, not be a body or not have a body, whatever that means, right?
Right.
And these are the 3 things we get right now. I have these 3 things that say in the first Friday. Right. Okay. These are the 3 things that he needs to have from his God. Otherwise, when he's going to prove it, he needs to get to prove these things. Right. He needs to prove that his truth, what he calls amitus amitusoi. In other words, I'm actually not sure right now that that's what he means by amitusoi, but means him to be non-contingent, means him to be the leader, the turner of the Galgal, and it needs him to be one, which to him means, And all of these things, or at least 2 of them, or most of them, he understands this idea of the Manega Galgal thing. Usually, at least he said that way, he also proves the Yichid and the Anegit from, that's the proof that we were trying to work through. The proof that he proved at the Manega Galgal, remember? The Pravitza proven this in the that's the first proof. This first proof. First philosophical proof. Over here. This was this was trying to line and then I'm going to this line. It's not here. Here, remember? In addition.
Right.
And it seems that's what we got through, tried to understand last time. This is also the thing of him being Managoyla, when we say God, the God of the world. This is important for the whole concept of Hashgacha, apparently. Lamas line.
Right. Okay.
Where's my phone? Another. So we had the Rambam did this thing where he summarized Aristotelian physics. It's actually one of the best summaries that exists. Rambam didn't get of knowledge. That was his big gift. he then didn't do it so many times in Moira because he deliberately confused it, but this is actually one of his very organized discussions. There's a lot of
Und die 26 Dummes?
the 26 Gekdumas is he made it up himself. He doesn't seem to have a source. He didn't copy it from anywhere. He read whatever the books he was supposed to read about this, and he said, okay, so this is really the things that we need. And the Anuchas is basically the Anuchas was a daf that's Mechir Zamatiyas Hashem, but it basically summarizes everything in physics. And seems to have been one of his big accomplishments by his organization. Du definieren wir 20 Anuchas, was ist gewesen. So dem kommt aus שיש מניעה שנייה סחוימה שזה הלמיינה המסחב וכולה לקבל הסצירה. כאשר חוי כמה מניעה סמניעה כולה וזה אז חייב בכך שימוץ למניעה I had this article that went through the proof and try to explain. מסחייב בכך שימוץ למניעה אחר אמינה עליהם אמינה. God, he had the why? So what was the Finevitz one? Maybe we should read the Hanukkah and try to remember. The 25th Hanukkah was that every specific thing has made of Choma and Tzira, and therefore it needs an efficient cause. And that's what it said in the 25th Hanukkah. Because the Choma didn't get a tzira by itself. That's basically what this thing was. Choma doesn't get a tzira by itself, and therefore this is the Yisrael proof. Therefore, I will do. Yeah. What he's getting to is the number one, that there's 4 different kinds of motion. I think I'm going to do 4 kinds of motion. Makes it very complicated. This proof. Heiße macht so complicated. It goes like this. Yeah, we already know that everything is change. Everything that happens are kinds of change. Now, another word for change is motion. Yeah. Right? And therefore, everything that exists has changed also, because everything that exists, at least under the moon, has changed because it exists, and that means that it exists with a chayim and a tzira. which means that it came into existence.
Why?
And
Why under the moon is it more?
because he's going along with Aristotle, who thinks that things on top of the moon, how do you call it, actually didn't come into existence. So they don't have that kind of change. They only have a different kind of change.
What kind of Chomer? What does that do with Chomer? They also have Chomer Tzida, no?
I think that he has a confusion about that. They have a fifth kind of Chomer, the Rambam says, and it never stopped moving. That's the idea that he had.
It never stopped moving. Where in Lamal?
Yeah, the Galgalim are always moving. They're infinitely moving in a circle because that's the only way you could infinitely move. Mashank and all the other things, which is Misava Vekula, that's what he's talking about.
What?
Everything on this world, everything under the moon, on the sublunar world, seems to none of them exist forever. So therefore, they have a efficient cause in the sense of someone else putting together the Chaim and the Tzira. It seems like the Galgalim themselves. It was.
Is that Kasaida de Gazach? This official cause, like that's causing us to.
No, it happened.
Okay.
I don't think it has to happen all the time. It has to have caused it to start existing. Right? If you go to no, it has to have caused it to start existing. And you need to have a cause, something. That's what it said in Hanukkah 25. Anything that has Chomer and Tzira, that's what it said. It didn't say that anything. This is it's different. And the 25th Hanukkah, it said that everything has a Chomer and a Tzira, and therefore it needs a cause, what we call an efficient cause, a poil, he calls it, which means something that prepared. That's the language in Shahayim, that's a Chomer and a Tzira. And therefore, we need to find out who it was. This was Aristotle's very basic idea that if you see a table, you have to assume that the tree didn't just come into a table, someone made it into a table. That's what we mean by pushing the Chomer into it. That's literally what it means. That's at least the emotion, but it abstracts from that. But that's literally what it means. Right? You could, he's not worried right now. He's technically worried how everything started. Right? If you think about, if you go back to how this physics works, if you think about how things came to exist, so tables came to exist from wood and table-ish, seat-up form of table, but that's not enough, right? So there needs to be something that made the wood into a table. That's what we mean by efficient causes. That prepares the Chomer to get a tzira. And then we could go back and talk about efficient causes. It's a weird way. It means the thing that made it. Acted on it.
Efficient means touching.
No, it just means the melushin. It's a weird Yerisha from Latin. It means melushin, not like efficient, but you're efficient. In melushin, acting, affecting. And if you could go back, and this is just about the table, right? If you go back to the tree and talk about something that must have caused the tree to become whatever trees are into trees and so on. He kind of doesn't get into so many details, so we don't really, but and so on. Until we get back to wherever everything started, which is Nachashana. Maybe there's some prime matter known as Chomer Yili. out of which something formed all of the forms.
That sounds weird.
But that yeah. So therefore, this is the kitzah. So the kitzah, this part is actually simple. In other words, what he needs to do is to get from the first step that he does is to get from anything existing to the moon. That's interesting. The first step, probably the step that we least agree with. And he explains it in Barichas, but this first step is anything that exists with a form, with a chomer and a tzira, and that means that something must have formed it into that tzira. Now, how do we get from that to the? How do we get from this kind of change to how did this change happen, right? How did this change happen? So, Teretz is this is the Teretz. Something must have pushed it. So we know generally. So if you read what he says, so it must have been moved in some way. So there's different kinds. So he says there's 4 kinds of motion, 4 kinds of movement. All of them are called movement, as he explained earlier in the Perdanocha. So therefore, there must be some Mimina Shleimina means not like I read one, but means there needs to be some kind of motion that caused it. Some kind of motion that's what caused it, right? Well, what kind of motion does it have to be? It could mean what he explained. There's different kinds of motion. It could mean the motion that remember there's different kinds of motion. It can become more or less, or it could become. It could have became. It links to 3 kinds of motion, and change happens in 4 kinds of. There's 4 kinds of change, which are 4 kinds of motion, which are basically things can be mishabed bekuda. They could become and disappear. They could become more or less, which is called kamas, or they could change in the sense of the changing attributes. They could eiches become cold or hot and so on, and they could change in place. They could move place. That's what we call movement, place movement. But all of the others are kinds of movement, also according to him. Just this is movement, and that's change movement. So they're just kinds of change. Really, when we say motion, we mean change. In other words, motion in place is just a specific kind of motion, or in other words, change, which to him is very important kind for a certain reason. But it's the first kind. That's why he wants to get to there. Basically, since then the Chustanish will say that so we could tell that's so anything has to let me just land. We're going to try to do the first thing. Do was that in gets so this chayv sheyesh meniya sheniya sachoyim shel lemania mushav v'kul kabbalah tzira. Since this world is a world of choyim and tziras, and which in other words the world that happens and mushav v'kul, which is a kind of change, right? We become with the first kind of change after the change in the category of substance, the category of essence, and therefore we have to find who caused them to change, who caused that. Who prepared this chayma? Who made the trees from whatever trees are made of, tree stuff and so on. So there's always something, and it's usually with the close one, the first one, the proximate one, is easy to identify. We have to find out who is the other one. Right? And who caused? I made a tree, and who made me, and so on. We have to find the cause, which from some kind of motion could be and any of these 4 kinds of change must have caused this change. That's perish on the mina shlam mina. In other words, since there's 4 different mina taniya, so one of these mina taniya must have caused things to come into being. And now this is the big thing. The third hanocha was that we cannot have an infinite chain of causes. That doesn't make sense, according to him. Therefore, it has to stop. In other words, there has to be a first cause. get out by the first cause of this kind of change, the kind of change that exists under the moon. So we have to find kind of the first kind of change. That's really what he's doing. Which means the Galgal. And Sham Nifsekes, so he seems to have skipped a step here. I'm not sure, but this verse at least explains it. That he means, since he explained in over there where he talked about the 4 categories of change, he explained that the first kind of change is change in place. Thanks for saying it. And Hanukkah Abbas, he must quote it here also. It doesn't make sense that he must. It seems to be based on that. In the 14th Hanukkah. In the 14th Hanukkah, it said that the movement is the first kind of movement. Because things becoming into being and being destroyed must first change a little bit, because you have to first be abyssal. At least before you get destroyed, you have to first be a little.
You have to move, but?
No, 1 second. I can't do movement. Evel Zogan as movement, what we call it. Movement in place must be the first kind of motion. Why does it have to be the first kind of motion? Because obviously, change in the category of substance, change of things becoming into being, had to first have change somewhat. And for any change to happen, the thing that had to happen by something, the thing of that change that had to come closer to it. Right? I was trying to say something like this. I'm not sure what he's saying. The basic shuttle seems to be that since any change must happen by something touching something else, and therefore that in order for that thing to touch, it had to have moved in space to get to it. So therefore, any movement really starts from movement in space. Therefore, if we're going, this was his shuttle the way down. So therefore, if we go back to thinking what's the first one, since we have to stop at some place, the first one must be that kind, because there can't be a different kind before it. And that's what that have to have caused. The first one, if we go back to the chain, we just jump to the beginning of the chain, because there has to be the beginning of this chain. And what kind of movement is the first one? It must be the movement one, because any other one that won't give us a movement to be able to make sense. So therefore, the first one is the movement. Now, which movement is this? This is the movement of the Galgal, who only has that kind of movement. It seems to be missing. This is the chattel that says in this thing. That's what he says. Therefore, the Galgal movement, which, as he said in the 14th Hanukkah, is the first one, and therefore, therefore, every movement comes from that, and that every movement somehow causes everything else to exist, and so on. And then it's going to go back and so Adkan. So basically, this we already got more or less to a God. Right? We already got to the first cause. You just have to think who caused this first movement to happen. Right? There's schon ein step back from the end. And over there, he wants to talk about if the Mani Hagagal is a gift or not a gift, and so on. There's a question. There's no gift to them, and ich will at least verstehen die Sache. And he some days gelernt, and he macht the mass with the hand.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, but at least
he did it twice.
So, but at least now, does it make sense? This whole mass, or does it make sense?
Sort of.
Sort of.
It's very hard to get into their whole thing, you know. So removed to their type of thinking. You know what I mean? It's
Okay, then we have to think about the then basically we have to get to the also er is masbra, they zwei Stücklich, and basically the second paragraph is kind of like shows how actually he could trace everything to the moon turning, well, to the Galilei turning. But first he has like a theoretical thing. Well, this is the erste sort movement, Mizan is the erste sort, and he kind of jumps to say, and that's the one from the moon. My nephew says, weiß nicht was.
That's the one from the moon.
All these things work together with Aftrach as a lesser. And so an idea of a Zuk, then we have to read the physics to figure it out. We'll get to it. And so the idea is eigentlich zusammen. And so an idea of a Zuk, dass du alles, everything is kinds of motion, and we kind of, since we need this to stop, we can trace everything back to locomotion, to movement in space.
Right.
Because, and therefore, so, it's weiß schon, the erste Sort sagt, or the erste is our movement in space. That's the first time.
Okay.
That's an abstract proof. Now, a second thing, and since that's the first kind, that's also a kind that can go on, and let's not know anything else about that right now. Therefore, that's the moon. That's the Galilei Reich. Wer so das ist die zweite Sache? Weiß nicht. Das ist why? How did this identification happen from this surah? This is just a surah that it must be a kind of movement. But he already assumes, and he already told us, that the moon has this purely movement. It doesn't have any other change, right? That's the whole thing. Big finger, it doesn't change in any other way besides for moving. But he just knows that already, and therefore assumes. And then he goes on and says, "K'moi kain, ich kann dich weisen, is a jede movement kommt bakit mit nifgag le mushel. Wenn man gesteckt a Stein, so gesteckt a Steck, so gesteckt a Hand, so gesteckt der Gitten, so gesteckt der Schrieden, so gesteckt der Zaf, so gesteckt der Chematiri, so gesteckt der Zira, so gesteckt der Idea, as we got machen the Fenster, so gesteckt, which was caused by the lift, which was caused by the Gandon. Right? That was his Kadgadio. So therefore, you could see, and the way he shows it kind of shows us how weird it is, because I would never think this gentle. But we could see that actually the galga that made the wind, that made the cold, that made you want to turn, that actually caused everything. He's trying to like show you from an example, from the reality. And he seems to think this is probably only one digman. Somehow traced in the Eveg. And this whole this seems to be important. But this is like what it seems to mean. That's why we get a lot of other things. The importance of the heavens to here seems to be very important to him. And this whole image of reality is that the heavens turning, the Galan turning, is what causes everything. Literally causes everything. Right. It literally causes. They call it the long chain of causes, but it literally causes everything. Right.
All right.
I'm gonna stop this for now.